Hey guys, tonight we slip back into a world lit only by fire, where superstition reigns. Monks hoard leech jars like treasure, and your doctor might prescribe a paste made of pigeon droppings for your migraine. We're plunging into the wonderfully bizarre world of medieval oddities, started with medicine so wild. You probably won't survive this, literally SO. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you all tune in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together that you're lying on a rickety straw mattress, sweating through a fever. And here comes Brother Alwyn, the local healer. He has exactly two tools: a prayer scroll and a pot of fermented dung. In the world of medieval medicine, this actually qualifies as a house call. The moment you open your mouth to complain, he nods solemnly. Clearly, you're suffering from an imbalance of humors. According to Galen, a long dead Roman physician who medieval folks still idolize, everything in your body, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, has to be in harmony. Too much black bile? That's melancholy. Too much blood? Congratulations, you're now sanguine and also maybe hemorrhaging Tio fix you. Alwyn reaches for a live leech. He calls it Henry. Henry's going to draw out the excess. The leech is applied directly to your temple while a prayer to St. Apollonia, patron of teeth, don't ask why, is whispered nearby. If Henry doesn't do the trick, it's time for the pigeon. Not the whole pigeon, just its warm, freshly killed innards. Applied directly to your chest, of course, for balance. Historians still argue whether this was done for real physiological benefit or simply to distract patients long enough for the fever to pass, or not. Now, if you had a toothache, things got real creative. A common diagnosis was toothworms. Actual, tiny wriggling demons believed to live inside your molars and gnaw away at your sanity. The cure? Burning henbane seeds and letting the smoke fumigate your face while chanting the Lord's Prayer backwards. Did it work? Absolutely not. But it gave everyone something to do on a Tuesday. Another crowd favorite, trepanation. You got migraines, seizures, hearing ghosts? Great news. They're going to carve a neat little hole in your skull to let the evil spirits out. No anesthetic, obviously, but don't worry, they'll wipe the blade with wine. Sanitary. Still, not all medieval cures were horrifying. Some were just perplexing. A remedy for gout, for example, involved roasting an owl, grinding it into powder, and mixing it with boar fat. Spread liberally on the feet. It's like vapor rub, but with way more owl. Another gout cure included the ashes of a goat's hooves. Bonus points if the goat had a name. And don't forget the urine wheel. This helpful chart told your doctor everything he needed to know about your health based on the color and taste of your pee. Yes, they tasted it. Yes, that's commitment. Golden yellow? All good. Cloudy pink with floating bits? You're probably dying, but it's a great teaching moment. Monasteries doubled as infirmaries, which meant most monks doubled as semi trained medics. Their medicine cabinets were filled with herbs like comfrey and wormwood and things like powdered mummy. Yes, ground up Egyptian mummies were shipped to Europe and snorted like a protein shake for the soul. Rich folks love this because nothing says vitality like a 2,000-year-old corpse in your smoothie. But perhaps the strangest treatment of all was music. Some healers believed in the doctrine of affections, which held that music could rebalance the body's energies. Feeling weak? A lively lute tune. Too excitable? Gregorian chants. Honestly, compared to pigeon paste, that doesn't sound so be it. IT wasn't all disaster. In southern Italy, a brilliant surgeon named Hugh of Lucca, and later his son Theodoric, actually questioned the use of pus as a sign of healing. He dared to clean wounds with wine-soaked cloths and stitch them closed, revolutionary at the time. Naturally, the medical community branded him a heretic for not letting wounds fester in God's time. Medicine in the Middle Ages was more art than science, and more guesswork than either. Still, people lived through it. Somehow, perhaps it was the leeches. Perhaps it was the power of belief. Or maybe pigeons really are magical. Anyway, sleep tight knowing that if you'd had a fever in the 1300s, your odds were pretty low unless you had access to a monastic apothecary, a few pigeons, and a forgiving sense of smell. You wake up tied to a chair in a damp stone room. Candles flicker. A crowd gathers, eyes wide, some with snacks. It's going to be that kind of day. You've been accused of stealing a loaf of bread, or maybe consorted with the devil, or maybe you just annoyed the wrong Lord. Either way, you're about to face justice. Not with a jury, not with evidence, but with one of the most medieval things imaginable, a trial by ordeal. First up, trial by fire. You're handed a red hot iron bar and told to walk 10 paces with it. If your hand miraculously heals in 3 days, congratulations. You're innocent and probably a saint. If it blisters and festers, guilty. Also infected. But don't worry, you'll likely die before execution. That sounds rough. Consider trial by water. You're tied up and tossed into a river like a soggy bag of laundry. If you float, you're guilty. Clearly, the water, a symbol of purity, has rejected your sinful soul. If you sink, innocent, also drowned. It's a win-win for justice and a lose-lose for everyone else. Point one variation, called cold water ordeal, was mainly used on suspected witches. Spoiler, everyone floated. The logic? Witches had renounced baptism, so holy water would refuse them. It's like being canceled by a puddle. And then there's the trial by morsel. No, not a cooking show. This is where you eat a big hunk of dry bread and pray not to choke. If you swallow clean, God says you're good. If you gag or turn purple, guess who's guilty? Scholars still argue whether this was symbolic or just a really weird day at the bakery. These trials weren't limited to peasants. Nobles got their own ordeal. Trial by combat. Two armored dudes smack each other until one yields, dies, or dramatically faints. Victory equals innocence. You're watching this in the stands now, maybe munching on roasted chestnuts, placing mental bets. Sometimes nobles hired champions to fight for them. Sometimes they just did themselves, limping in with gout, swinging a broadsword like a toddler with a wiffle bat. There's a case in 1386 where a knight accused a squire of murder. They fought in full armor before King Charles VI. The knight won, and justice was declared served. No one remembers that the squire was guilty, only that he was very, very dead. You might be wondering, how did people accept this? Historians still argue whether belief in divine judgment was absolute or simply the best option in a legal system that couldn't read, didn't document, and definitely had no CSI lab. Sometimes, miracles were expected to intervene, like St. Cuthbert's bones glowing during trials, or statues of the Virgin Mary leaning ever so slightly toward the guilty party. Divine Shade, Medieval Edition. Clerics and monks occasionally tried to soften things. They'd recite prayers, bless the ordeal tools, and, in rare moment of mercy, fake the results. If they liked you, your iron bar might be just warm, not molten. Of course, if they didn't like you, one of the oddest rituals was the corsned, a cursed mouthful of food, bread and cheese, blessed and hexed. The accused swore innocence while eating it. If they swallowed it peacefully, they were pure. If they choked, their soul had betrayed them. Imagine courtroom dramas today if trials ended with a cheese plate AS for repeat offenders. Well, repeaters often didn't get a second ordeal. They got branded, banished, or worse. But sometimes a creative lord might suggest a wager of law, where 12 of your neighbors swear you're innocent. And if they lie, they're in trouble too. Hope you were popular. It's hard to overstate how deeply people believed divine judgment would manifest. Thunderclaps were seen as verdicts. Cows refusing to give milk after a trial? Ominous. Your neighbor's turnips thriving post-verdict? Divine confirmation. Not all ordeals were brutal. Some were just weird. In 10th century Ireland, there's record of truth from bell ordeals, where the accused had to swear innocence while holding a sacred bell. If the bell rang without being struck, guilt was certain. If not, you're probably off the hook. Bells weren't particularly cooperative, which helped be why the late Middle Ages. Trial by ordeal began to fade, especially after 1215, when the Pope officially banned clergy from participating. That made it harder to sanctify the process. Without the church's blessing, burning people for floating seemed less divine. At end time, rational legal systems began to develop, evidence, testimony, scribbled notes with wax seals. But a tiny part of you misses the chaotic clarity of medieval justice. You were either sunk, roasted, or choked. No appeals, no hung juries. Just you, your sins, and a very suspicious loaf of bread. You're sitting nervously in the village square when the crowd hushes. Out comes a judge, flanked by scribes and robed officials, followed by the accused, four-legged, muddy, and snorting. It's a pig. And no, you're not hallucinating. Today, this pig is on trial for murder in medieval Europe. Animals had legal responsibilities. If a pig wandered into a house and mauled a baby, which unfortunately happened more than once, it could be arrested, tried, and even sentenced to death. Full trial, defense counsel, witness testimony. A pig in shackles, IT sounds like a twisted cartoon, but these trials were serious. The 1386 trial of a pig in Falaise, France, is one of the most well documented. The pig was found guilty of infanticide and executed in public, dressed in human clothes, just to really drive the point home. Historians still argue whether this was purely symbolic or part of genuine belief in moral accountability across species. And it wasn't just pigs. Cows, goats, dogs, horses, even insects were summoned to court. Locusts eating crops? Bring them to trial. Mice stealing grain? Legal notice posted on the barn door, demanding they vacate the premises. Monks would read the eviction aloud, loudly. At the mice, the legal systems made bizarre distinctions. Domestic animals were tried in secular courts. Wild creatures went to ecclesiastical ones. So, if your cow killed a man, that was a civil matter. But if a plague of toads haunted your monastery, better call the bishop. The accused animals were often appointed a defense lawyer. There's a record of one named Bartholomew Chassenee, who made his name defending rats accused of stealing barley. His argument? They couldn't attend court because cats pose a safety threat. The judge paused the trial to consider. This wasn't satire. This was jurisprudence. Some animal trials served as social control. Executing a pig wasn't just punishment. It was a warning to keep livestock fenced, children close, and chaos at bay. It was theater with a moral. But others veered into the mystical. A rooster in Basel was once burned at the stake for laying an egg, a feat considered demonic. Roosters weren't supposed to do that. This one was either cursed or working with Satan. Either way, toast. Sometimes animals weren't punished but excommunicated. Whole towns would gather as bishops formally cast out swarms of insects. Candles were lit, bells rung, Latin muttered, and somewhere out in the fields, the bugs continued munching unimpressed. Yet not all animals were scapegoats. Some received bizarre legal protections. In medieval Islamic courts, for example, a man couldn't legally divorce his wife for eating meat unless the meat was bought legally, emphasizing the importance of the animal status in the market economy. In India, cows weren't just spared, they were revered. But in Europe, animal trials peaked in the 13th to 15th centuries, when legal record keeping blossomed and communities needed tangible villains. What better culprit than a rooster with suspicious timing or a pig with a taste for mischief? And yet, despite the absurdity, some of these cases dragged on for years. There's an account of weevil infestation in 16th century France where the bugs were tried, defended, and eventually offered a separate vineyard as their new home. You can imagine the jury, 12 men, staring at a box of weevils, nodding solemnly. If this all sounds a bit extra, remember that medieval people weren't necessarily stupid. They just lived in a world where religion, law, and superstition tangled like a ball of yarn. They didn't see animals as mindless. They saw them as actors in God's moral drama, capable of being vessels for good or evil. Eventually, Enlightenment thinkers laughed these trials into history. By the 1700s, most animal cases had ceased. But echoes linger. Even today, animals can be euthanized for public safety after an attack, modern language for an ancient impulse. So, as you lie there, eyes heavy, imagine the solemn procession of a pig in a cloak, guarded by knights, approaching the gallows with the weight of justice on its squishy shoulders. Somewhere, a monk rings a bell. Somewhere, a fly refuses to leave the courtroom. And you, witness the most surreal of trials, drift into sleep wondering if the rooster really did it. You blink awake in a shadowy basilica, marble cool beneath your knees, incense swirling. All is hushed until the doors crash open and a group of monks shuffle in carrying a corpse dressed in papal robes. Not in a coffin, sitting upright. His face is pale leather, jaw slack, eyes sunken, and you realize you're about to witness a cadaver synod in January 897. Pope Stephen VI decided to put his dead predecessor, Pope Formosus, on trial. Real trial. Witnesses, judges, legal arguments. The corpse was propped up in a throne, dressed in full papal vestments. A deacon stood beside him, answering questions on his behalf in what must have been the weirdest ventriloquist act in history. Stephen accused Formosus of perjury, of ascending the papacy illegally, and, perhaps most shocking, of switching political allegiances. This was less about divine justice, more about petty revenge dressed in holy garb. Historians still argue whether Stephen was pressured by powerful Roman families or simply off his rocker. The corpse, barely tethered to the world of the living, was found guilty. Its papal garments were stripped, the three blessing fingers on its right hand ceremonially chopped off, you know, just in case he tried to bless someone posthumously, and the body was tossed unceremoniously into the Tiber River. Imagine the crowd. Equal parts horror and fascination. Some gasped, others probably took notes for their bar trivia team. It was grotesque political theater, religiously justified, and medieval politics loved a good grudge. Just a few years earlier, Pope John VIII had been bludgeoned to death by his own clerics. After Formosus, Pope Boniface VI reigned for 15 days before dying mysteriously. The papacy in this era resembled a Game of Thrones subplot with extra incense and less personal hygiene. But nothing topped the spectacle of a rotting pope on trial. It was so scandalous, so surreal, that it triggered riots. Stephen VI was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually strangled in his cell. That's karma, medieval style. And in a rare twist, Pope Formosus got a posthumous reversal. His trial was annulled, his body fished out of the river and reburied with honors. Not once, but twice. Because if you're going to lose your fingers and your dignity, at least get a decent plot and end. These papal feuds weren't just limited to bizarre trials. They extended to relic raids, theological insults, and full-on schisms. One pope once excommunicated another, who then returned the favor. The faithful were left scratching their heads, unsure whose blessings actually worked anymore. This era of the Church, called the Saeculum Obscurum, or Dark Age of the Papacy, saw more than a dozen popes installed and deposed like chess pieces. One was elected at age 18, another bribed his way in, and a third supposedly sold holy offices like baseball cards. And yet, somehow, the church endured, perhaps because even through the chaos, the rituals still soothed, the bells still rang, the Latin still echoed through the cloisters. Even if occasionally the Mass was interrupted by the sound of someone shouting, "The corpse is guilty," there are stranger footnotes. A 14th century manuscript describes a trial of a relic, a finger bone supposedly belonging to St. Peter, accused of being fake. Scholars debated its authenticity for hours, using liturgical text visions and at least one goat's behavior as evidence. The relic was eventually acquitted, because of course it was. The Cadaver Synod, grotesque as it was, lingers in the collective imagination as a symbol of just how far the medieval world would go to fuse law, religion, and personal vendetta. It asks questions no one should have to answer. Can a corpse defend itself? Can holiness be revoked post-mortem? And most importantly, who does the laundry after something like that? You leave the basilica, the echo of footsteps behind you, and the faint smell of mildew and old incense in your nose. A chill follows, like history breathing down your neck. Somewhere beneath Rome, the bones of Formosus rest, hopefully undisturbed this time. Hopefully. Your feet clack sharply against cobblestone as you strut through a medieval town, and heads turn, not in admiration but concern. Because you, my friend, are dressed to kill. Literally. Welcome to the deadly world of medieval fashion, where looking good was often just a step away from falling down the stairs and breaking your neck. Let's start at the toes. You're wearing polanes, those absurdly long, pointy shoes that curve like tiny skis out in front of you. The longer the tip, the higher your status. Some nobles had them so long, they needed to be tied to their knees with little chains to avoid tripping. Elegant? Sort of. Practical? Absolutely not. The church, of course, hated them. Priests preached that Pallane wearers were stomping into sin. Historians still argue whether these shoes were more about fashion or good old aristocratic peacocking. Then there's your tunic, dyed a rich blue, which means someone somewhere crushed a lot of woad leaves and probably went mildly insane from the fumes. Next up, the belt. Not to hold your pants up, those don't exist yet, but to hoist a decorative dagger and possibly an embroidered pouch full of perfume soaked cloth. Because, fun fact, medieval cities smell like open sewers and despair. Now look up. On your head, a hennin. A towering conical hat, if you're a lady of high status, or maybe a chaperone, a twisted Wildona hat worn with enough flair to make a modern fashionista cry. These hats were status symbols, but they also caught fire a lot. Candlelit hallways and flammable fabrics are a bold combo. Some fashion choices were downright hazardous. Men wore tight hose and doublets that left little room for movement or breathing. Knights off duty favored padded codpieces, partly for modesty, partly for protection, and partly because no one ever said subtle in the 1400s that women's gowns had sleeves so long they dragged in mud, caught on door handles, or occasionally took down small pets. To achieve that coveted pale look, they smeared their faces with lead-based creams. Did it poison them slowly? Yes, but worth it for cheekbones that said ethereal and internally decaying at the same time in corsets? Oh, they existed. But earlier versions were more like rigid bodices designed to flatten the chest into an angelic pancake. One surviving garment even had iron stays. Stylish, until you had to bend down to pick something up or breathe deeply. There was also the coat hardy, a tight-fitting button dress worn by both men and women. Getting into one required assistance, prayer, and possibly lubrication. Once inside, you looked sleek. Getting out was another ordeal entirely, especially if you'd had one too many honeyed Alish. But fashion wasn't just about vanity. It was law. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what based on class, income, and profession. If you were a merchant, you couldn't wear for a reserve for nobles. If you were a baker, good luck rocking a velvet cloak. Violators were fined, shamed, or forced to swap outfits on the spot. Some people got creative. Tailors stitched contraband fabrics inside their coats, so only the lucky few who got close could admire the forbidden velvet lining. It's like medieval haute couture meets petty rebellion. And don't forget religious fashion. Pilgrims wore badges shaped like saints' fish or, no joke, a man urinating into a flask. These were souvenirs and social currency. The more obscure your badge, the holier your road trip had clearly been. Monks wore scratchy wool robes called habits, sometimes with added discomfort for spiritual brownie points. The hair shirt, coarse goat hair worn against the skin, was a fan favorite among masochistically devout types. Itchy, painful, and a constant reminder that God was always watching and slightly judging your epidermis. Fashion even crept into armor. Knights sometimes engraved their breastplates or added colored feathers to their helms. There's a tale of one noble who went into battle wearing a gold-plated codpiece. The logic? If you're going to die, die looking fabulous. And in tournaments, competitors dress in heraldic colors so bold and clashing they give modern designers a migraine. One knight painted his armor entirely green and refused to speak for the entire event. Why? No one knows. Maybe drama. Maybe chafing. Even peasants had their styles: linen shifts, woolen over tunics, woven belts. On festival days, they might rent or borrow rich garments, like medieval prom night. And shoes made from straw or rough leather weren't glamorous, but at least you wouldn't fall over walking 10 feet, a you sauna back to the muddy street. Tripping slightly on your overlong sleeves and nearly igniting your hat, you realized fashion wasn't just about status or aesthetics. It was about identity, rebellion, ritual, and survival. In a world without mirrors, you dress for others. And sometimes those others included saints, kings, or very judgmental barn animals. You hear the music before you see the crowd: lilting pipe tunes, tambourines jangling, feet thudding rhythmically against the cobblestones. At first, it seems like a normal festival, until you realize no one's smiling. No one's even blinking. They're dancing with wild, jerky desperation, some weeping, others foaming at the mouth. And no one can stop. Welcome to the summer of 1518 in Strasbourg, where one of the strangest plagues in history struck. Not with fever or boils, but with uncontrollable dance. You clutch your cloak tighter as a woman collapses in front of you, legs still twitching. The dancing plague has begun. IT started with one person, Frau Trophia, who stepped into the street and began to dance, alone and without music. She danced for hours, then days. Within a week, dozens joined her, all helplessly compelled. Historians still argue whether this was mass hysteria, a form of ergot poisoning, or something darker. City leaders, believing more dancing would somehow cure it, built a stage and hire musicians. Predictably, that backfired. By the end of the month, hundreds were affected. Some danced until their feet bled. Some reportedly died from exhaustion, strokes, or heart attacks, though the death toll remains a topic of scholarly squabble. And this wasn't a one off event. Dancing plagues occurred throughout medieval Europe, in Aachen, Cologne, Metz, and even the Netherlands. Always sudden, always inexplicable. The afflicted would form circles, chains, even synchronized routines, like some horrifying flash mob. No one invited them. No one knew why. The church had its theories, of course. Some blamed St. Vitus, whose feast day often coincided with outbreaks. Vitus became the unofficial patron saint of involuntary groove sessions. Pilgrims built shrines, hoping prayers would stop the rhythm from getting them next. Medical theories were equally confused. Doctors blamed overheated blood, unbalanced humors, or hot winds of melancholy. One physician recommended cold baths and moderate food. Another suggested marriage as a cure, because, sure, why not? Some scholars now suspect these outbreaks were a mix of stress-induced psychosis and poor nutrition. Others argue that communal trauma, war, famine, plague, eroded collective sanity just enough to ignite these outbreaks. And then someone danced, and everyone followed. The 1518 case came at a rough time. Recent famines, oppressive taxes, and diseases had worn the population thin. Imagine living through one nightmare after another, and then suddenly your body rebels. It won't stop moving. No one can explain it. And the music never stops. You slip through the crowd now, heart pounding, and spot a group of barefoot dancers swaying near a fountain. One child stands stock still, watching with wide eyes, clutching a wooden toy. An old man tries to pull his wife away, but she shrieks and twirls back into the fray. The air smells of sweat, rain, and something vaguely metallic. Occasionally, local authorities blamed witches. Naturally, accusations were flung, and in some towns, suspected dance starters were whipped, imprisoned, or burned. Others were forced to wear iron shoes or heavy belts to stop their movements. But repression rarely helped. People danced anyway, like puppets on invisible strings, marionettes of madness. Not all responses were punitive, though. In certain cases, towns organized pilgrimages to sacred shrines, carrying the afflicted on carts or slings. In a strange twist, many of these dancers recovered once they reached a holy site. Whether that was divine intervention or just a really long walk, no one knows. A lesser-known outbreak occurred in Apulia, Italy, and was dubbed tarantism. The belief was that a spider bite, probably from the infamous tarantula, caused manic dancing. Victims were given music, usually frantic tambourines and violins, to sweat out the venom. Some of these dances evolved into what we now call the tarantella, a cheerful folk dance that began as an exorcism in disguise. You duck into a shadowed alley, avoiding a shirtless man flailing in circles while shouting nursery rhymes. His eyes lock with yours, and for a second you wonder, is it contagious? Maybe, maybe not physically. But hysteria, panic, and motion spread like wildfire when the world makes no sense. You feel your foot tapping now. Just once. But you stop. WY autumn. The Strasbourg outbreak faded. Whether the dancers died, recovered, or simply ran out of steam is unclear. The records go quiet. Life moved on, yet the fear lingered. For years after, any spontaneous jig drew nervous glances. Musicians were asked to tone it down. And you, centuries later, lie in your bed wondering if rhythm could truly become a curse. Just imagine it. Sleepwalking through cobbled streets, led not by dream but by a beat only you can hear. Your body won't stop, even as your mind begs it to. Somewhere in the distance, a tambourine jangles, and your toes twitch once more. You jolt awake with a sharp pain in your jaw. Congratulations! It's the year 1342, and you've got a toothache. No anesthesia. No toothbrush. No floss, just agony and a local barber surgeon sharpening his tools on a leather strap. Welcome to the darkly inventive world of medieval dental care and brain surgeries. Or, as they called it, Tuesday. Let's start with that tooth. In the absence of toothbrushes, most people use chew sticks, little twigs with frayed ends, or rinse with wine, vinegar, or even, yes, their own urine. Why? Because urine contains ammonia, which has mild cleaning properties, and because toothpaste hadn't been invented yet. Also, EW, but the go to explanation for toothaches wasn't cavities, it was toothworms. Small, squiggly beasts believed to burrow into teeth and gnaw from within. You can even find medieval illustrations showing tiny worms curled inside molars like smug little demons. Historians still argue whether this belief came from actual parasites being spotted or just someone misinterpreting tooth. Our Otito cure toothworms. A healer might burn henbane or other strong herbs, then direct the smoke into your mouth. If the worm smelled and crawled out, voila, success. More often, your gums just got numb and your hair singed if that didn't work. It was time to extract. You'd be hauled into the town square or into a market tent. The barber surgeon, because yes, the guy who trimmed beards also did amputations, would use iron forceps to yank out the offending tooth. Sometimes, if the tooth didn't come willingly, he'd use a dental pelican, a hook like device that popped the tooth out like a cork. Local crowd reactions range from polite interest to enthusiastic applause. Now, let's raise the stakes. Say you're not just in pain, you're seeing visions seizing or suffering from what we now call epilepsy. Time for trepanation. This ancient practice, carried into the medieval world from the Greeks, Egyptians, and even Neolithic times, involved drilling a hole into your skull to release evil spirits. And not metaphorically. People believed actual demons or malevolent forces could live inside your head. If you behaved strangely, the solution was obvious. Open a window. Trepanation was done with Japan, a circular saw, sometimes hand cranked, without anesthesia. Your scalp was cut, the skull shaved, and the boring began. Some surgeons were careful, others less so, but incredibly, people survived. Many Japan skulls show signs of healing, meaning patients didn't just live, they walked away, possibly cured, possibly with a new breeze through their thoughts. You lie there now, imagining the sensation, a tickle of heat, a thud as the saw scrapes bone, and the faint scent of burning hair and panic. A monk whispers prayers nearby. A nun dabs your forehead with lavender water. And somewhere outside, a goat bleats indifferently. Trepanation wasn't only for seizures. It was used to relieve pressure from skull fractures, migraines, or even madness. One physician suggested it as a cure for melancholy, another for lovesickness. Because clearly, the best cure for heartbreak is the hole in your head. There were less invasive methods, too. Doctors sometimes prescribed head rubs with vinegar, herbal compresses, or, oddly, mouse grease. And don't forget amulets, little stones, saintly relics, or even dried frogs worn around the neck to ward off the madness. No word on whether to help your social life. Then there's a curious case of cranium powder. Yes, ground up human skull used as a medicine. Rich nobles believed consuming powdered bone from a justly executed man could cure epilepsy and other afflictions. Bonus points if the skull came from someone holy or heroic. You'd mix it into wine, stir, sip, and hope for divine absorption. For the less adventurous, bloodletting remained the go-to fix. Open a vein behind your ear, drain some blood, and hope your humors rebalance. If not, repeat next week. Some charts even match the ailment to specific veins, because of course they did. Despite the chaos, there were glimmers of genuine advancement. The Trotula text, a set of medieval medical writings focused on women's health, included sensible dental hygiene advice. Rinsing with salt water, avoiding sweets, a real challenge, given the medieval obsession with honey, and chewing herbs like mint or fennel. Islamic scholars like al-Zarawi and Avicenna wrote detailed surgical manuals, including surprisingly modern-sounding descriptions of dental extraction, cauterization, and treatment of head wounds. These works filtered into Europe slowly, often mistranslated, sometimes misunderstood, but still valuable, and yet in many corners superstition ruled. If you woke up with a headache after a stormy night, someone might blame a witch. If your toothache worsened near the full moon, you get garlic tied to your chin and prayers recited backward. Standard procedure. You lie back now, nurse your phantom tooth, wondering what was worse, the belief in tooth worms or the flaming herbs shoved in your mouth to expel them. But one thing's certain, thank your lucky stars for modern dentistry. And maybe floss a little extra tomorrow. You shuffle into a dimly lit cathedral, the scent of beeswax candles stick in the air, and they're on display, behind glass, under velvet, with two very bored looking monks guarding it, is a human toe. Not just any toe. It is, they claim, the sacred toe of St. Bartholomew. And for the low price of a copper coin, you can kneel before it and receive a blessing. Welcome to the surreal and bustling market of medieval holy relics. Relics were big business in the Middle Ages. Bones, blood, hair, nails. If it came off a saint, it could be venerated. Pieces of Christ's cross, the Virgin Mary's breast milk, even the foreskin of Jesus. Yes, really, several of them made the rounds. People believed these objects held divine power, healing the sick, protecting cities, even ensuring victory in battle. And if you had the right relic in your cathedral, pilgrims and their wallets would come from miles away. But let's not pretend this was all above board. The relic trade was chaotic, with thousands of churches all claiming to have the same saint's finger. The math didn't exactly add up. Historians still argue whether this was willful deception, enthusiastic faith, or just an ancient version of everyone gets a trophy. One monastery claimed to have John the Baptist's head. Another also had John's head. A third claimed to have his jawbone. And yet another, oddly, a tiny shrine dedicated to his second head. A theologian once joked that there were enough pieces of the true cross scattered across Europe to build Noah's Ark twice. You lean over a display case now, inspecting what's labeled as St. Catherine's eyeball. It looks suspiciously like a marble, but the monk beside it swears on his cassock it's genuine. You nod solemnly. It's rude to ask questions in here. Relics weren't just religious tokens. They were power. Kings and popes gave them as diplomatic gifts. Armies carried them into battle. They were placed under altars, sewn into garments, and sometimes even stolen. Monks would sneak into rival abbeys at night and smuggle out bones wrapped in linen. It was called holy theft. And bizarrely, it was often considered justified, especially if the thief claimed the saint wanted to be moved. There's a wild case in 9th century France where monks from the Abbey of Conques stole the bones of St. Faith or St. Foy from a neighboring town. They snuck in, waited for everyone to fall asleep, nabbed the relics, and spirited them away like medieval ninjas. When the townspeople found out, they were furious. But the monks argued that St. Faith had appeared in visions, requesting the relocation. Divine U-Haul, relic authenticity was, understandably, hard to prove. Many were bought from shadowy dealers who swore their goods came straight from the Holy Land. Never mind the smell or the suspiciously fresh look of that ancient finger. Entire markets sprung up around relic sales, with traveling vendors hawking saintly shin bones next to roasted chestnuts in ceramic jugs, and the relic containers, called reliquaries, were often more impressive than the items inside. Gold, jewels, intricate carvings. One reliquary for St. Valerie's head is shaped like a full-size bust of a woman holding her own head, just in case the message wasn't clear. Some relics had reputations. Pilgrims flocked to them with hopes of miracles. There were healing bones that supposedly cured blindness, pieces of shrouds that stopped plagues, even saintly teeth that protected against drowning. Pilgrims left offerings, coins, wax figures, sometimes replica body parts carved from wood or wax to represent what they wanted healed. Knees, hearts, livers, you name it. You pass by a reliquary shaped like a foot with a sliver of something brown nestled inside. Maybe it's a sandal fragment. Maybe it's a splinter. Maybe it's a very old raisin. Either way, it's venerated. And of course, this booming relic economy attracted counterfeits. Some clergy couldn't resist padding their church's collection with a few forged items. In England, one priory proudly displayed a feather from the Archangel Gabriel. Another had the bones of a giant, which suspiciously resembled whale ribs. Pilgrims didn't care. They wept, prayed, donated. Faith, after all, doesn't demand logic. The Protestant Reformation would later rail against this relic obsession, calling it superstition and idolatry. Reformers destroyed thousands of relics, melting down reliquaries, scattering bones. But for hundreds of years, these bits of saints shaped the geography of worship, turning small villages into pilgrimage hubs and elevating random bones to divine status as you leave cathedral. You glance back one last time at the saintly toe. Did it really belong to Bartholomew? Hard to say. But for the pilgrim who limped in and left believing in miracles, it didn't matter. In a world of plague, famine, and fiery sermons, sometimes you just needed something, anything, to hold onto your crouch to the edge of a cramped apothecary, dodging jars labeled dragon's blood and wolf liver, when the shopkeeper whispers conspiratorially and slides a long, spiraled object across the counter. Unicorn horn, he says, eyes glittering. It looks suspiciously like a narwhal tusk. You nod politely. Welcome to the wonderful, weird world of medieval cryptozoology and magical medicine, where unicorns were real and so were basilisk eggs, medieval bestiaries, those gorgeously illustrated books filled with lions that look like shaved cats and elephants with hooves, weren't just nature guides. They were moral guides. Every animal, real or imagined, had spiritual symbolism. And unicorns? Oh, they were stars. Said to be wild, pure, and tameable only by a virgin, they represented Christ's chastity and the ultimate flex in your relic cabinet. People paid fortunes for unicorn horn, believed to neutralize poison, cure epilepsy, and detect treason. How? Supposedly, the horn would sweat or change color in the presence of poison. Royalty dipped it into goblets as a safety measure, though most horns came from narwhals or rhinoceroses. Still, if it sparkled and spiraled, it passed the vibe check. Now, let's talk about the basilisk. Half snake, half rooster, and all nightmare fuel. Born, according to legend, when a rooster laid an egg and a toad hatched it under a dung heap. Already off to a strong start. The basilisk could kill with a glance, wilt plants with its breath, and leave a trail of scorched earth. How did one defeat such a beast? With a mirror? Or a weasel, bizarrely? Apparently, weasels were immune to basilisk vibes and would just chew its face off. Nature, you scary. Historians still argue whether tales of basilisks and cockatrices, a very similar creature, just slightly more dramatic, were attempts to explain natural disasters, snake bites, or simply very bored monks with excellent imaginations. I in your hand now is a delicate egg, labeled basilisk egg. It's probably an ostrich egg. Maybe, maybe not. Monks used to display these in cathedrals as trophies. Some were painted, others mounted in gold. All were totally terrifying if you didn't know what a rooster was biologically capable of. And the griffin, lion body, eagle head and wings, guarded gold in the east and was often depicted in maps of places no European had actually visited. Its claws were coveted as chalices, its feathers, holy relics. Again, probably just exaggerated accounts of lions, or a very large bird someone met in a bad mood. The kraken, meanwhile, haunted the northern seas, vast enough to pull ships under with its tentacles. Sailors feared it, storytellers loved it, and medieval maps helpfully marked it as here be monsters right off the coast of Norway. Were they seeing giant squids? Sunken logs? A whale having a bad hair day? Possibly. But when your compass is made of lodestone and twine, a sea monster sounds like a reasonable explanation. Then there's the amphisbaena, a two-headed serpent that could roll like a hoop. It supposedly came from the blood of Medusa and was so venomous that its own corpse remained deadly. Want to ward off evil spirits or cure arthritis? Tie a dried amphisbaena around your neck. Caution. Maybe expired, and let's not forget the bonacon, a large bull with curl horns and a, let's say, defense mechanism. It repelled attackers by releasing fiery diarrhea up to 30 feet behind it. This creature was catalogued without irony in bestiaries, and even made it onto medieval wall hangings. Because nothing says sacred knowledge like a flame-farting bull. You leaf through a bestiary now, marveling at whales mistaken for islands, foxes faking death to lure birds, and beavers biting off their own testicles to avoid hunters. Real animal behavior? Not really. But in a world without YouTube, you took your nature facts with a grain of salt, and possibly some unicorn horn. These mythical creatures weren't just stories. They seeped into medicine, politics, even law. If someone died mysteriously, people whispered of basilisk glances. If a king wanted to show divine favor, He might display a griffin claw during a feast. Traders sold powdered dragon bone, probably just dinosaur fossils or creatively named rocks, to cure everything from gout to heartbreak. Even mermaids were part of the medieval mythos. Sometimes they lured sailors to their doom. Sometimes they offered wisdom or warning. In one 13th century tale, a mermaid is captured and kept in a convent. She prays. She weeps. She escapes. The moral? Never underestimate a fish lady in a nun's habit. Today, we see these stories as fantasy. But back then, they were tools, explaining the unknown, reinforcing morality, and occasionally just scaring the pants off children. They filled the blank spaces on the map with wonder, dread, and just enough detail to make you hesitate before wandering too far into woods as you close the bestiary. A small scroll tucked in the back reads, "Never feed a weasel after midnight, especially near a basilisk egg." Wise words. Sleep well, and maybe tuck your unicorn horn under your pillow, just in case. You sit down for dinner in a candlelit hall, surrounded by noble guests. A silver platter arrives, bearing roast peacock, gilded apples, and a buttery fish pie. You reach for a fork, only to freeze. Gasps ripple around the table. Eyes widen. You've just committed a scandal so grievous it borders on heresy. Because in the medieval world, eating with a fork wasn't just weird, it was downright suspicious. Forks, you see, were once seen as symbols of vanity, decadence, even blasphemy. In much of Europe, fingers and knives were standard utensils. Spoons? Acceptable, especially for stews and porridge. But a two-pronged piece of metal for stabbing your food? That was too fancy. Some even called it the devil's tines. Take the case of a Byzantine princess who brought golden forks to her Venetian wedding in the 11th century. The locals were scandalized. When she died of the plague a few years later, preachers said it was God's punishment for daring to eat with such an effeminate, unnatural device. Historians still argue whether this was anti-Eastern bias or just a case of cultural whiplash. The church, in its medieval mood, wasn't thrilled about forks either. Some clergy claimed it was an insult to God's design. After all, if he gave you fingers, why invent new ones out of silver? Others thought it smacked of luxury and pride. The very sins monks were supposed to avoid for centuries. Europeans pinched, scooped, or jabbed their food with knives. Meat was often cut in midair, passed from servant to noble's dog, then torn by hand. Bread served as both food and napkin. You might even use the crust to scoop gravy, just don't double dip. That was frowned upon even back then. You watch now as a lord stabs a pear with his dagger, lifts it to his mouth, and lets juice dribble down his chin. Elegant. But when a rogue servant tries to offer him a fork, slender, ornate, and polished, he recoils like it's a cursed object, which, socially, it might as well be. Despite this fear, forks eventually wormed their way into elite households, especially in Italy, where influence from the Byzantine court was stronger. In Florence and Venice, wealthy merchants began using forks at banquets, often just for sticky or delicate foods like candied fruits or slippery noodles. Still, this was a risky move. You could be admired for refinement or mocked for pretension. Things began to shift during the Renaissance. By the 16th century, Catherine de' Medici brought her Italian fork habits to the French court, and though her countrymen rolled their eyes, they slowly began to follow. France, the trendsetter table manners, eventually made forks fashionable, even essential. Soon after, the English aristocracy followed suit, albeit grudgingly. Even then, forks were used only for certain foods. Sweets, pasta, delicate fish, anything hearty, roast meats, bread, pies, still got the knife and fingers treatment. And the average peasant? Forget about it. Forks were rare, expensive, and deeply impractical when your dinner was boiled turnips on a wooden plate. It wasn't just about utensils. It was about control. The fork symbolized restraint. Precision, a shift from ravenous gorging to genteel nibbles. Table manners became part of aristocratic identity, separating the refined from the rabble. A noble might practice delicate fork etiquette in private, preparing for royal banquets where a single clumsy jab could ruin a reputation. As the 17th century crept in, England's upper classes began carrying their own cutlery sets in velvet pouches. personal knives, sometimes a spoon, occasionally a fork. These sets were called eight wees, and owning one was a status symbol, like having a custom smartphone case today, but more likely to be used in a duel. Still, resistance lingered. The philosopher Thomas Coriat praised a fork in 1611 after a trip to Italy, calling it neat and practical. His English friends mocked him mercilessly, nicknaming him Furcifer, fork bearer, and accusing him of being foreign obsessed. You imagine poor Coriat trying to eat dinner while everyone around him loudly chewed with their hands in protest. Even after Fork finally gained acceptance, debates continued. How many tines? Two? Three? Four? Should it be curved? Straight? Long enough to skewer meat, or short and nimble like a pastry thief? In the 18th century, the fork's rise was solidified. Etiquette manuals instructed on its proper use. Left hand only, don't wave it around, and never lick it clean. Forks were no longer scandalous. They were sophisticated. But that early fear of metal prongs remained tucked in the cultural subconscious, a ghost of dinner parties past. Now you recline in your chair, fork resting delicately on your plate. No one faints. No one calls you a heretic. But for a moment, you remember the whispered gasps, the Byzantine princess's doom, and the dangerous thrill of eating pears with steel fingers. And tomorrow, maybe you try eating soup with a knife, just to see what the Middle Ages would have thought of that. You wake to the scratch of coarse fabric against your skin. It itches. No, it burns. You've been blessed or cursed with one of the most spiritually fashionable garments in history, the hair shirt. Worn tight, rough, and absolutely unlined, it clings like guilt and smells like wet sheep. Congratulations! You've entered the strange, prickly realm of medieval self-punishment couture. The hair shirt, or cillis, was a favorite among medieval monks, penitents, and particularly dramatic saints. Made from goat or horsehair, sometimes even woven bristles, it was designed not for style, but for suffering. The consonant served as a divine reminder of sin flesh and your place in the cosmic food chain. You tug at your neckline, praying for relief, but that's kind of the point. In the medieval mindset, pain equals purification. So the more uncomfortable you were, the closer you crawled to salvation. And why stop at shirts? Some believers wore iron belts with inward facing spikes, hobnailed sandals, or chains under their clothes. Devotion, but make it dermatologically challenging. St. Thomas Becket allegedly wore a hair shirt so encrusted with lice that it stank to high heaven when he was martyred. St. Francis of Assisi rolled naked in thorn bushes to curb impure thoughts. St. Catherine of Siena slept on planks, fasted into near invisibility, and wore an iron chain under her gown. Her mom was not thrilled. Historians still argue whether this was genuine devotion, performative suffering, or just what happens when theology meets teenage angst and wool. Probably all three, but the hair shirt wasn't just for saints. Nobles sometimes donned them too, especially after scandals. Got caught embezzling church funds? Slip into a goat fiber hoodie and parade through town barefoot. Instant penance. Better than jail, arguably in some cases. Penitents wore them beneath fine clothes. Imagine a courtier, draped in brocade, secretly itching like mad during a banquet, while maintaining polite conversation. Ah, yes, the pheasant is delightful, and my armpits are on fire. Thank you. Monks turned self-denial into an art form. Benedictines embraced silence and simple robes. Cistercians made their own clothes from untreated wool. Flagellants, those wandering bands of penitents, took things further. They marched through towns whipping themselves in unison, chanting hymns, demanding repentance from all. It was like an extremely loud, extremely bloody flash mob. The church tolerated them until they got too popular and started veering into cult territory. Meanwhile, in illuminated manuscripts, tiny doodles show monks wearing hair shirts while writing sermons. Some even doodled their discomfort. Little figures hunched over, scratching, frowning, or occasionally tossing their shirts into infernal flames. Monastic humor, it turns out, was very niche. The idea behind all this suffering was simple. The body is weak, the soul eternal. By disciplining the flesh, one drew closer to God. This wasn't unique to Christianity. Ascetic practices appear in Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, but medieval Europe took the fashion angle to new levels. Certain garments had built-in symbolism. A rope belt with three knots: poverty, chastity, obedience. A patched up cloak: humility. Bare feet in the snow: either a pilgrimage or someone really committed to their Instagram aesthetic 800 years before it existed. You glance around now at your fellow penitents. One adjusts his iron girdle. Another sharpens the spikes on his leg chain. You nod in mutual understanding. Tonight's dinner? Bread, water, and judgment. There's also the phenomenon of voluntary silence. Some took vows for years, even lifetimes, wearing signs around their necks, mute for Christ. They walked through noisy towns like holy ghosts. You could tell a truly devout mute by the number of people accidentally bumped into. And in case you thought it was just a religious elite, remember this: peasants, too, performed acts of public penance. If you cheated your neighbor or insulted a priest, you might be forced to wear a sackcloth tunic, carry a candle, and beg forgiveness in front of the whole village. Humiliating? Yes, but surprisingly effective peer pressure that fashion as penance could even shape politics. When King Henry II felt guilt over the murder of Thomas Becket, he walked barefoot to Canterbury Cathedral and let monks flog him in public. Hair shirt beneath his royal robes. Crown slightly askew. Majesty meets masochism. Of course, not everyone agreed on the value of suffering. Some theologians argue that focusing too much on bodily pain risked pride, a spiritual irony. Others noted that suffering didn't always lead to virtue. Sometimes it just made people cranky, rash covered, and weirdly obsessed with goats. But the hair shirt endured, quietly, scratchily, as both a garment and a metaphor. Even today, we talk about wearing a hair shirt when someone takes on unnecessary guilt or discomfort. It lingers in the language like a ghost of goat fiber past. As you curl into your straw bed tonight, the hair shirt clinging like burrs, you wonder, was this really the road to holiness? Or just a very itchy detour? Either way, you're definitely not sleeping until you're trudging along a dusty pilgrim road, feet blistered, cloak crusted with mud, when up ahead you spot a group of fellow travelers, singing bawdy songs, waving carved walking sticks, and one of them is proudly toting a loaf of bread shaped like a phallus. Welcome to the Holy Trail, where piety meets parody, and your fellow pilgrims might just be carrying relics of dubious holiness and humor. Pilgrimages were a spiritual cornerstone of medieval life. You might walk hundreds of miles to see the bones of a saint, touch a miraculous shrine, or simply atone for that one time you accidentally stole your neighbor's chicken. But along the way, something funny happened. The sacred and profane collided. Take the infamous phallic pilgrimage badges. These little lead or pewter tokens were sold at holy sites, meant to show where you'd been and what blessings you'd gathered. Some were reverent, depicting saints, crosses, or holy doves. Others? Well, let's say they leaned into other regions. There are surviving badges of disembodied male organs riding on carts, flying through the air with tiny wings, or even being paraded like holy relics by monks. Historians still argue whether these were jokes, fertility charms, or oddly specific protest art. And speaking of margins, medieval manuscripts were full of them. You'd be reading a solemn prayer or a gospel passage, and in the margins, a snail jousting with a knight, a monkey playing the bagpipes, a nun pulling up her skirts to reveal. Well, let's keep it PG-13. These marginalia weren't random scribbles. They were deliberate, cheeky, and surprisingly common. Some scholars believe they were inside jokes between scribes. Others think they were subtle commentaries on the absurdities of church and court. You flip through a worn psalter now, and there, just beside Psalm 23, is a drawing of a bishop chasing a rabbit with a sword. The Lord is indeed your shepherd, especially if you're an armed bunny. Monks, especially boar ones in scriptoria, doodled these during long hours of copying texts. The results range from charming to unsettling. Elongated snails became a running theme. So did grotesques. Strange humanoid faces with animal features, often contorted into exaggerated expressions. It's like medieval meme culture etched into gold leaf. Not all pilgrims were pious. Some were more like medieval tourists, stopping at every tavern, collecting cheap badges, and swapping scandalous tales. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales captured this perfectly. A bawdy, boisterous crowd of knights, millers, wives, and pardoners, all pretending to be holy but mostly in it for the journey and the gossip. Along the way, You'd find shrines to saints both famous and obscure. Saint Uncumber, for example, was said to have grown a miraculous beard to escape an unwanted marriage. Pilgrims left offerings of hair. St. Guinefort, a greyhound venerated as a saint in parts of France after saving a baby from a snake. Yes, a dog. People brought their sick children to lie beside his grave. The church was not amused. At the shrine of St. Arilda in Gloucestershire, visitors sought healing by crawling through a small hole in the church wall, supposedly a test of moral purity. Those who got stuck were judged accordingly. Somewhere nearby, a merchant sells commemorative tokens shaped like tiny stuck humans. You pass a band of singing pilgrims now, led by a man in a scallop shell covered cloak, the mark of a Santiago pilgrim. He's holding a mock relic, a toe of St. Elvis. Beside him, someone juggles apples. Another reads aloud from a poem about a friar and a fishmonger's wife. The line between reverence and revelry? Paper thin. Even churches leaned into the vibe. Some hosted festivals of fools, where clergy swapped robes with choir boys, sang parodies of hymns, and crowned a lord of misrule. It was a release valve for a world tightly wound in ritual and hierarchy. Once a year, even bishops might laugh. And then there's a penitential pilgrimage. We were forced to walk to a shrine as punishment. People wore signs around their necks detailing their sins: adultery, theft, heresy. Others walked in silence, barefoot, even wearing masks shaped like pigs or demons. Public shame. But with a travel itinerary as you reach your destination, the crowd surges forward. Someone sells miracle water in bottles shaped like butts. A band plays a merry tune, while a priest gives blessings between sneezes. And you, weary but grinning, slip a very questionable badge into your satchel. A rooster riding a donkey. Why not? Because in the end, medieval life wasn't just hardship and piety. It was delightfully weird. And the road to salvation? Sometimes it was paved with fart jokes, flying phalluses, and a very determined snail. You finally arrive at a castle, grand, towering, and surrounded by a moat. From a distance, it looks majestic. Up close, it smells like someone poured a chamber pot directly into your nose. Because guess what? They probably did. Welcome to castle life. All glamour above, all sewage below. You step inside, eyes wide. The stone halls echo with the clatter of boots, the barking of dogs, and the occasional thud of something unmentionable hitting the courtyard. Castles might be seats of power, but there were also giant, cold, poorly ventilated rock boxes where plumbing was, let's say, experimental. Let's begin with the medieval toilet, the garderobe. Essentially a vertical shaft leading straight to the outside, often hanging off the side of the tower, like a weird architectural pimple. You sit or squat on a flat stone with a hole in it, and gravity does the rest. Below, a cesspit, or a moat, or the unlucky courtyard. On windy days, the draft might reward you with a little splashback. Pleasant. Some garderobes emptied into designated latrine pits, cleaned by unfortunate servants with strong stomachs and very little pay. Others drained into the castle moat, which, surprise, quickly turned from defensive feature to swampy cesspool. Historians still argue whether moats were originally meant for sanitation, or they just turned that way by accident. Either way, you're not going swimming, and yet despite all this, people cared deeply about hygiene. Sort of. Nobles bathed when they could, in wooden tubs filled with heated water and surrounded by fragrant herbs. Rose petals, lavender, even mint, because if your bathwater is questionable, at least your stench can be floral. You pass a servant now, lugging chamber pots, ceramic containers used when the garderobe was too far, too cold, or too risky. These were emptied by flinging the contents out windows or doors. Hence the phrase garde-à-l'eau, from French regard as low. A polite warning to anyone walking below that human waste was incoming. Duck accordingly. Inside, the castle's great hall is buzzing. Roasting meats on spits, boisterous laughter, and dogs chasing each other underfoot. It's beautiful until someone relieves themselves behind a tapestry. Yes, really, tapestries didn't just decorate. They also provided discreet corners for less than regal business. Still, castles tried to manage cleanliness. Floors were strewn with rushes, aromatic grasses mixed with herbs, to mask odors and absorb spills. These were replaced, eventually, sometimes, often enough to grow ecosystems underneath. Mice, fleas, and the occasional mold patch made themselves quite at home. And don't get too attached to the idea of privacy. Bedrooms were shared, beds were communal. And if you wanted solitude, you were probably up to something suspicious. Lords and ladies had private chambers, sure, but even those were bustling hubs of gossip, business, and occasional emergency piglet delivery. Despite it all, castle living was better than the alternatives. You had stone walls of protection, a roof over your head, and food, often more than the average peasant could dream of. But comfort? Not quite. Glass windows were rare and expensive. Most used oil parchment or wooden shutters. Cold drafts whistled through corridors. Blankets were thick, but so were the lice. Still, castles innovated. Some added murder holes near entrances, tiny slits where boiling water or hot sand could be dumped on invaders. But just as often, those holes doubled as air vents for garderobes. You can imagine the aroma. Bathhouses were occasionally built into castles, especially in luxurious palaces like those in the Islamic world or the Holy Roman Empire. Heated floors, tile pools, and elaborate plumbing were rare but real. The castle of King Roger II of Sicily had features straight out of a spa. Meanwhile, his contemporaries in England were still dumping chamber pots out the window. You pause now near a cistern, part of the castle's rainwater collection system. Clean water was gold. It was used for cooking, washing, and occasionally drinking. But most people stuck to ale. Safer, tastier, and less likely to include fraud bits. And laundry? An ordeal. Clothes were rarely washed. Too much risk of wear and tear. Instead, garments were brushed, beaten, or aired out. Underclothes got a scrub more often. Wool tunics? Not so much. You could tell a noble's status by how far away you could smell them. Toothbrushing? That existed. People used cloth, salt, or twigs. Bad breath was masked with mint, cloves, or, if you were fancy, chewing bits of amber. Still, dental hygiene was largely a matter of hope, and hardy gums as the sun sets over battlements. The castle hums with activity. A juggler performs in the courtyard. A dog chases a chicken. A small boy yells Gardaloo from above. You dodge left just in time to eye in this strange, smelly stronghold. Life continues. Gritty, loud, oddly beautiful. And as you retreat to your straw-filled mattress tucked near the garderobe, lucky you realize medieval people might not have had flush toilets, but they had ingenuity, humor, and a very flexible definition of clean. You're walking through a quiet medieval village when a piercing yowl shatters the morning air. A cat darts across the square, narrowly avoiding a boot. But it's not just one angry villager. It's an entire crowd, armed with sticks, shouting, laughing, and chasing cats. Welcome to one of the strangest and most unsettling episodes of medieval weirdness, the Great Cat Massacre. This was no isolated outburst. Across Europe, particularly in France, cat hatred bubbled just beneath the surface for centuries. Cats, especially black ones, were associated with witchcraft, heresy, and feminine power. People believed they consorted with demons, carried spirits, or were witches in disguise. Historians still argue whether this fear stemmed from folklore, religious paranoia, or just cats' generally judgy behavior. In Paris during the 1730s, yes, it lingered that long. Apprentice printers carried out what's now called the Great Cat Massacre. After enduring long hours, bad food, and even worse lodging, these young workers turned their frustrations toward their master's beloved cats, symbols of comfort and favoritism. The apprentices rounded them up, held mock trials, and executed them in the courtyard. It was grotesque and oddly ritualistic. The cats were proxies for everything the apprentices hated but couldn't attack: their bosses, the system, their own powerlessness. Anthropologists and historians like Robert Darnton have examined this massacre as a window into working class humor and rebellion, an outlet for rage disguised as farce. But you don't need a thesis to know something feels deeply wrong when a mob laughs at a yowling animal. Medieval life had its share of rough justice, and sometimes the victims weren't people at all. But it wasn't just cats. Medieval Europe had an eye-watering array of bizarre acts of violence, often hyperspecific and culturally baffling. In Germany, there was a festival where participants beat a rooster buried up to its neck. In England, there were cock-throwing contests where people hurled sticks at tethered birds for prizes. Barbaric? By modern standards, absolutely. But back then, that was Tuesday. Violence wasn't random, it followed weird codes. During Carnival, for example, towns exploded into chaos. Rules flipped, peasants mocked nobles, bakers dressed as bishops, and sometimes effigies of hated figures, tax collectors, landlords, or even Judas Iscariot, were beaten, burned, or tossed into rivers. Symbolic vengeance made literal. And then there were saints. Some were martyred in ways so absurd they belong in comic books. Saint Erasmus, for example, was allegedly disemboweled with a windlass. St. Lawrence was roasted on a grill and reportedly joked, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." Whether or not these things really happened, the fact that they were retold with admiration says something about the medieval comfort with extreme, performative pain. The violence extended to public punishment, too. Stocks, pillories, and flogging were everyday sights. Thieves might lose a hand. Adulterers might be paraded through town half naked. Traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered, literally sliced into bits, their limbs displayed on city gates like grotesque motivational posters. Yet even here, there was often a strange logic. Public punishment was spectacle. It reinforced order. You, standing in the crowd, knew exactly what behavior not to try after seeing someone's ear nailed to a post. Sometimes violence became ceremony. In Venice, the Doge performed an annual ritual of marrying the sea, symbolically asserting control over the waves. A golden ring was thrown into the water. Meanwhile, upriver in some forgotten village, a goat was being symbolically drowned for a harvest ritual. Everything was symbolic. Everything was literal. It was all very medieval. You pass a child now, tugging a wooden cat on a string. Her grandmother hisses and crosses herself. Old fears die hard. Even today, the image of a black cat evokes superstition. It's a relic of centuries where animals were more than pets. They were omens, allies, enemies, scapegoats. Not every cat met a fiery fate. Monasteries often kept them to hunt mice. Some were even pampered, painted into manuscripts with little gold halos. One scribe famously wrote a poem praising his cat, Pangorban, for keeping him company during long nights of study. So while some saw cats as Satan's footmen, others saw them as saintly companions. Violence in the Middle Ages wasn't always about hate. It was about power, ritual, and survival. But when you hear the echoes of laughter during the Great Cat Massacre or picture a rooster peeking nervously out a hole, you realize that the line between cruelty and comedy wasn't just blurred. It was often non existent. You step over a discarded cat mask now. Paper, painted, crumpled. Maybe it was used in a festival or a prank or something darker. Either way, it whispers of a world where jokes could bite, and every tail twitch might be mistaken for a heresy. You're sitting on a hillside just beyond a village, twilight settling in, when something wet and soft splats beside you. You look down. It's meat. Raw, sky-fallen meat. No storm clouds, no slaughterhouse nearby. Just chunks of beef dropping from the heavens. Welcome to the final act of medieval weirdness. The utterly inexplicable. This bizarre event, what we now call the Kentucky meat shower of 1876, actually happened post-medieval, but echoes countless reports from earlier centuries of mysterious things raining from the sky: frogs, fish, blood, even iron nails. And in the Middle Ages, every strange drop from the heavens was packed with meaning. Was it divine wrath? Witchcraft? A saint's leftover miracle? Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect natural phenomena, misinterpretation, or a society that expected the sky to speak back. Take the Green Children of Woolpit. According to 12th century chroniclers, two children appeared near the village, speaking no known language, wearing unfamiliar clothes, and with skin of vibrant green. They were discovered near a wolf pit, dazed and confused. The boy died shortly after, but the girl learned English and explained they came from a twilight world underground where everyone was green. Some modern theorists suggest this was malnutrition or mercury poisoning. Others say aliens or fairies, because why not? Then there's a medieval story of a man in the moon, a figure said to have been banished there for Sabbath breaking. One version has him hauling sticks on a Sunday, seen eternally in the moon's light patches. Another story tells of a German peasant who was whisked into the sky after cursing at a saint's statue. He returned days later, fluent in Latin. Convenient. Sometimes it wasn't the heavens acting up, but people. In 1375, villagers in England claimed a woman spontaneously combusted while milking a cow. Her husband blamed sorcery. Others suspected alcohol. No investigation followed, because honestly, no one knew what to investigate. Medieval annals are riddled with one off weirds, single paragraph entries noting strange occurrences. A chicken born with human feet, a man who barked like a dog, a baby born with 3 heads and a tail. Were these real, allegorical, or simply the medieval version of clickbait? Local monk sees fire breathing toad. You won't believe what happens next. One village claimed a talking pig recited verses from the Psalms. Another spoke of a man who sneezed out bees. A 15th century report describes a rain of blood lasting for days, dyeing church roofs red. Skeptics say dust storms mix with iron rich clay. Believers say divine warning. Both agree, unsettling. And then there's the case of the cursed bread. In 944, in a French town called Pont Saint Esprit, dozens of people began hallucinating. They saw snakes, fire, demons. One man leapt out a window shouting, "I am a plane," well before the invention of planes. Some historians blame ergot poisoning, moldy rye causing LSD like symptoms. Others suggest mass hysteria. Or, again, witches. Stranger still are reports of people who simply stopped eating. Saints like Catherine of Siena or Nicholas of Flue reportedly survived for years on nothing but the Eucharist. Their bodies withered, but they glowed with divine light. Today, we'd call extreme anorexia. Back then, holy miracle. And for those longing to vanish into mystery, there were always the wild men of the woods, hairy, silent figures said to live outside civilization, speaking no human tongue, feared and revered. Some were believed to be fallen monks, others, divine hermits, and a few, just dudes who really didn't want to pay taxes. Witchcraft, of course, loomed behind much of this weirdness. A cow refusing to give milk? Which? Rain falling backward? Which? You tripped in a puddle 3 times? Triple witch. The medieval world was tightly woven with supernatural explanation, and every odd event had a reason, even if it involved midnight toad parades and invisible demons who stole your socks. But the truth is, these stories weren't just superstition. They were survival mechanisms. In a world where science hadn't yet caught up to curiosity, stories filled the gaps. They offered comfort, wonder, and a sense that someone, something, was in charge, even if it was a vindictive cloud full of beef. Now the stars are out. The meat rain has stopped. The green children are long gone, and the frogs have retreated to their ponds. You curl into your blanket, heart slowed, mind full of impossible images. Pigs on trial, basilisk eggs, pointy shoes, and blessed pigeon paste. And as your breathing deepens, a final whisper settles over you. Not from monks or saints or wild men, but from the medieval night itself. Strange things once walked the earth, flew in its skies, and danced across its pages. And maybe, just maybe, they still do. Now let's soften the edges of all that delightful weirdness. You breathe out, slowly. The images begin to fade. The clatter of hooves, the flicker of candlelight, the distant cry of a goose being exorcised. All drifts away. The air is quieter now, the night settled. You're warm, wrapped, still, just as you should be. Those medieval oddities, so loud and strange, begin to fold into dream forms. A basilisk curls up like a house cat at your feet. The green children giggle softly from a distance. Even the pigeon paste, that bizarre little remedy, now smells faintly of lavender and old libraries. Outside your imaginary window, a sleepy village flickers under a starlit sky. Somewhere, a scribe snores at his desk. A monk tends a candle. A castle guard hums off key. And above it all, the moon watches, kind and full, not judging, just remembering you're no longer walking through muddy roads or dodging flying meat. You're just here, resting, drifting. Let every mystery settle like dust in a bestiary. Let every bizarre belief about forks or unicorns or dancing plagues become nothing more than a feather soft echo. Odd, yes, but distant. Harmless, comforting, even you did well to wander through this world. You were brave to meet its monsters, and you were wise to smile at its strangeness. Now let your body melt deeper into the mattress. Let your thoughts slow. There's nothing more to discover tonight. The story is told. The relics are boxed. The chamber pots are emptied. Sleep now. Sleep well. Sleep deep.